My book, The Art and Making of Fantasy Miniatures, is available now. Check out the link in the description to find out more. This is a review of Anything You Can Imagine, Peter Jackson and the Making of Middle-earth by Ian Nathan. There's a point in this book where it uses the phrase, "Don't judge this book by its cover." Now, it's not actually being used in reference to this book, but I found it funny that the book contained that sentence, as that's exactly what I want to do, because this book is a prime example of why you literally can judge a book by its cover. Now, I'm going to rant about the cover here, so if that's not of interest to you and you want to skip ahead to where we get into the actual book, just jump ahead to this timestamp. So to suggest that this book is as bad as its cover would be cruel and untrue. It's certainly not that bad, in the sense that I doubt there's any book so horrible that it would deserve this cover, which is very likely the worst I've ever shown on this channel. Good cover design should not only be eye-catching and stand out when someone's browsing physically or online, but it should also communicate the idea of the book. A little test I like to do to assess how successful a cover is at achieving this is to imagine you can't read the title. And in this case, if you don't know what Peter Jackson looked like, what the hell would you think this book is about? And even if you do know this is Peter Jackson, what about this cover suggests anything to do with Middle-earth or its making? Surely that's the more exciting and appealing aspect of the book, the thing that anyone would be coming to this book for. Then the actual title of the book itself is the most embarrassingly ironic thing I've ever encountered. It's called Anything You Can Imagine, and yet this cover is all they could imagine. Anything you can imagine, and it's just a grey, boring, black and white, plain text. I really can't even, what were they thinking? But the fact is, they weren't thinking. This is a cover made by incompetent, clueless morons who have zero understanding of how to do their jobs. That's not mean, that's an indisputable fact. It's always hard to know who's to blame because book building, especially the cover, is typically influenced by a team, but I will say this cover designer and editorial team should never be allowed to work on a book cover again. A company paid them money to produce something that would promote their product in the best possible way, and this is what they came up with. Even this photo, I'm not trying to have a go at PJ's looks, but this is not a flattering photo and just uncomfortably close. And so not only is it unattractive, visually boring, but even worse is that it neglects 2/3 of the title. Anything You Can Imagine, Middle-earth. Yeah, real evocative of Middle-earth and imagination. Good grief. I genuinely cannot fathom how something so absolutely thoughtless could be approved. And you may say, God, why are you making such a big deal about the cover? But I think it is a big deal. The cover is arguably the most important part of a book, because no matter how good it is on the inside, people aren't even going to get to that stage if it makes a poor first impression. That's why I kind of find the whole idea of don't judge a book by its cover to be rather weak, whether viewed as an idiom or, in this case, when taken literally, because it puts the onus on the viewer and excuses laziness on the part of the creator when they're really the one who suffers the most from a lack of a good cover. Why should I care about your book when you don't even care enough to give it a good cover? If the cover is stupid and lacking in thought and care, then why shouldn't I assume that's probably reflective of the inside too? And unfortunately, this book is kind of proof of that. Describing exactly what this book is very challenging. In the broadest sense, you can think of it as the making of the Lord of the Rings movies, but as we'll see, that still might not be the most accurate description. The reason it's hard is because the book doesn't even know what it's supposed to be. It has no individual identity, and ultimately I don't know why this book needs to exist, or at least I don't know why it needs to exist in this form. Because everything about this book, everything inside and out, feels like a first rough working draft. A mock-up proposal for a book that could have eventually been awesome. But instead of working it and refining it, they were just like, nah, we'll just release it as is. It's such an uneven book. It's all over the place and completely lacks any sort of focus. In part, this is probably due to it trying to be the definitive story of the making of these movies, which it 100% is not, despite the marketing copy's blatant, absurd lies trying to convince you it is. Plus, it's a foolish thing to attempt anyway because it's impossible to do in one book, and so what ends up happening, naturally, is that in an attempt to cover so much, most stuff ends up being shallow and fleeting. We already have the DVD appendices and other making of books for The Lord of the Rings, and so this book ends up covering so much of the exact same ground rather than focusing on a more manageable, specific idea and going deeper. It needs a clearly defined purpose that would give it a reason to exist on fans' shelves, but it just doesn't. So to help get a better idea of the book, let's break down any assumptions you might have based on the title. First up, I don't understand the whole Peter Jackson angle that would necessitate him being in the title and on the cover, let alone the sole subject of the cover. Based on that, you might think this is some sort of semi-biography, or it's following the making of via his point of view or experience. No, it's none of that. Peter Jackson is of course the main character, but not necessarily more than any other writer-director on any other movie. You know, there's a tiny bit on his early work and occasional raves about how amazing he is, but my point is, if this book had have been released without him in the title and on the cover, you wouldn't be reading it thinking, geez, why is this book so focused on Peter Jackson? So I just don't understand why he's being singled out and focused on so heavily in the title and cover. Then the next part of the title, The Making of Middle-earth, also feels kind of misleading in that it's probably not what you'd expect. This book is more focused on the business of making the movie rather than the art of making the movie. So it's not really about the artistic, creative, or technical decisions that brought to life what you see on screen. There's definitely some of that, but most of this book is dedicated to the systems surrounding that. So focusing on the things that allow the magic to happen rather than the magic itself. So Hollywood wheeling and dealing, infrastructure, logistics, marketing, reception and impact, etc. Now, that's all very interesting stuff, and I just wish the book had have made that its sole focus and communicated that more clearly, as opposed to not communicating that in the title and watering it down, wasting space trying to cram so much other stuff in unsatisfactorily, which includes retelling tons of information you'll already know if you've watched the DVD appendices and read any of the other Lord of the Rings books I've previously reviewed. In fact, many of the chapters just feel like abridged versions of much better existing books like Brian Sibley's biography, Andy Serkis's Gollum book, the 20 Years of Weta books. This book takes bits from everywhere and crams them into one book and then tries to supplement it with some new stuff, which just isn't satisfying. The book shouldn't be contracting existing deeper sources, it should be expanding the literature by having its own identity, rather than being a Frankenstein of everything that's come before and making fans endure the same thing all over again, but in a less satisfying way. But let me be clear, it's not the pulling together of the sources that's the problem. That can be the whole reason some books are so great, pulling everything together to create a clear and convenient one-stop source. But this isn't the complete ultimate history of the making of The Lord of the Rings. If it was, that would have been awesome, and I'd be praising the pulling together of all the other sources to make the ultimate book. But that would require several volumes, whereas this is not even close. It's not even a good attempt, it's stupid, which is why I'm pushing the idea that this book should have been more focused and have its own identity, because that's at least a more realistic and achievable goal. Similarly, based on everything I've just said about the book biting off more than it can chew, you'd think it would be trying to take advantage of every sentence to maximize how much information it can fit into the book, but no way. The amount of fluff this book contains is insane. Stuff that is just uninteresting, worthless, time-wasting drivel without actual insight that should have all been completely cut out. It's the worst thing about this book, but unfortunately also what makes up its majority. And because there's so much crap on so many subjects, and because it's clearly written and edited by people who don't have a clue, it's also a very bumpy read, jumping all over the place, sometimes being organized chronologically but then jumps back or forwards in time. Other times it seems to be organized by subject until it goes off on a tangent or abruptly jumps to a new topic. This serious lack of focus, structure and flow makes it quite a chaotic book. The author, Ian Nathan, is quite probably the most insufferable writer I've ever read. I cannot stand his voice, and he uses a style that is very inappropriate for a book like this. Rather than being written in a normal way that you would expect from this sort of non-fiction book, the style feels like, gather round children as I tell you the legend of the making of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, that's exactly it. It feels like you're being told a legend of what it was like making the movie, rather than a no-nonsense detailed account of how the movies were actually made. So much of this book is just rhetoric about how amazing the behind-the-scenes achievements were, rather than how they were actually achieved, both from the author and the interviewees, who do also have their share in the blame, and the reason this is so bad is because, as I mentioned, it results in way too much fluff. The author just waffles on in such an inane and verbose way. He also inserts himself and his personal opinions into the book to an inappropriate and completely unbecoming degree, as if anyone brought this book to read about his thoughts and experiences. It's plagued by a serious lack of objectivity that a book like this requires, and includes too much of what feels like speculation and conjecture on the author's behalf. For example, you can pause and read this paragraph. It's ridiculous. Not only does it show how painful his writing is, but also how would he know this stuff? It's not okay to fabricate detail in a book like this. And if this is how the story was told to him by a first-hand source, then have them tell the story, not something that seems like the author's interpretation, which just makes me lose faith in his reliability as an author and questions everything else in the book. This book definitely needed to rely more on direct quotes and less on the author's embellishments and suppositions of how things must have gone down. The writing is often way too fanciful, uses pretentious, inappropriate vocabulary, and generates way too much of the fluff I was talking about. For example, it might be a whole paragraph like this. And all of this fluff here is particularly ridiculous when the very next sentence essentially conveys the same information but quoted from an actual source and in one succinct sentence. So why was this bloated, pretentious paragraph necessary? Space-wasting stuff like this is a frequent occurrence in this book. Other times it will just be absurd, distracting words or phrases. Like rather than saying something normal, such as a tip of the hat or a nod to, he says, doffing a wind-blown forelock. And it's like, why can't you just write like a normal person? Why is one of the defining features of this book the sensation that the author's desperately trying to show how clever he is? It's like he thinks he's Charles Dickens, but he just comes across as Charles Dickhead. This isn't the sort of book for that. Now, he's not the only writer who does this sort of thing. One of the most offensive, certainly, but plenty of authors sabotage their writing trying to be scintillating or indulgent. In fact, one of the reasons I usually never like Brian Sibley's writing is because he often does the same stuff. But there was none of that in his Peter Jackson biography, which was fantastic. And I like to think that's because he was wise enough to realize that he needed to write in a style that's appropriate for the book. Now, don't get me wrong, an author should inject some sense of vitality and soul into their writing, otherwise you just get a boring scholarly text. But it is very easy to push it too far, which this book shows the dangers of. There are just way too many cases where the writing needs to be more literal, which is just something he seems to have an aversion to, and shouldn't even be an issue for a book like this, and it just creates unnecessary confusion or is just plain annoying. Now, I don't mean to exaggerate how off-putting Ian Nathan's writing is, because it's not like this book's unreadable. Most of the prose is fine to read. It's maybe like once per page that I become seriously distracted by his style or the insertion of his own experiences and opinions, but that's still far too much and becomes a horribly defining feature. Whereas when I read a book, any book, fiction, non-fiction, unless it's like a memoir or someone's personal account, I don't want to be aware of the author, because if I'm thinking about the author or distracted by their writing, then I'm being pulled away from engaging in what's on the page or what I'm here for. And if that happens, it basically means you're failing your main job as a writer, and that's the ultimate reason this book is such a failure, because it's clearly written by someone incapable of writing this sort of book. So by now you're probably wondering, okay, so is there anything actually good about this book? And the answer is yes, definitely. The big enticement and strength of this book are the interviews Ian Nathan has done with the cast and crew over the course of 15 years. And although I still think it fails to take advantage of that, the fact is there are some really great anecdotes and interesting details about the making of these movies that I've never come across before, and that's what the entire worth of this book hangs on. And the desire for the mega fan to get their hands on that stuff is the only reason someone should consider getting this book. Now, as ever with any non-fiction book, how much information the book contains that is new to you is going to vary wildly from person to person depending on what you've experienced previously. But if you've watched the DVD features and read most of the Lord of the Rings books I've previously reviewed, then you're basically on the same level as me. And I can tell you that I genuinely did learn a lot. Maybe only 20% of what I would have hoped for given the book's page count and the 15 years of first-hand interviews and set visits being drawn on. But still, for me, as a huge fan, it was just enough to make it worth wading through all the crap in order to find the good stuff. Because when it's good, it can be really good. You know, I'll be reading, just trying to scan past all the worthless fluff and trying not to throw the book away in disgust. Then suddenly it'll hit me with something amazing I've never heard and is actually interesting. A one-sentence fact, an insightful paragraph, or a story that takes up a whole page full of quotes that's so revealing or just entertaining. And that's a wonderful experience to have when, as a fan of a series that's nearly 20 years old, you don't expect to come across a critical mass of information that has a profound impact on your understanding of the making of the movie, but there are times when this book did that for me. And so it's just such a shame that these good parts have been wrapped up and presented in a package that, on every other level, is just disgraceful. The other aspect of the book that's probably the most admirable thing I think it achieves is the level of openness and honesty that's often displayed throughout. Yes, there's also too much fawning over certain people, and especially the deifying of New Zealanders as a race set apart, but there's also instances where the book generates fascinating insight or engagement on subjects you usually don't hear spoken about with such openness in filmmaking, things to do with money, conflicts, even something like Peter Jackson admitting these aren't the perfect movies he imagined in his head, the sort of stuff you never get from books that come out at the same time as the movie, obviously because it's in everyone's best interest to put on a phony smile and produce a puff piece for the sake of promoting the movie. So if the strongest and best parts of this book are these interviews that it has clearly been built around, my question is, why wasn't that the focus of this book? Why wasn't this book something like Lord of the Rings, The Interviews, or The Making of the Lord of the Rings, An Oral History? All the best parts of this book, and even some of the bad parts, clearly lend themselves to the idea of this book being a retrospective oral history. Cut out all the fluff, all the unnecessary rhetoric, all of Ian Nathan's ego, all the stuff that's wasting time and space, and just have the interviews. I'd rather have the tale told by the subject rather than the author's questionable interpretations, embellishments, and need to cast himself as a character and storyteller. Instead, he should just be filling us in on any extra details and providing a discrete link between the quotes. This would have been a focused concept that gave the book an identity and a purpose, one which hopefully the publishers could communicate better too. There'd be a reason for fans to put it on the shelf and come back to it again and again, because as it stands, I'm never going to read this book cover to cover again. The only reason I'm even keeping it is for the sake of being able to access and reference the information that is good. But no, I will certainly not subject myself to it as a reading experience ever again. And compare that response to how I feel about Brian Sibley's biography, which I have read for pleasure many times and will continue to do so, which, taking both books at face value, should be the other way around, since I'm not particularly interested in Peter Jackson's non-Lord of the Rings work, but the biography is thoughtful and well written, whereas Anything You Can Imagine is a book so misguided that it's at war with itself on every level. And we will journey to the front line of that war in part 2 of this review, where we'll go through chapter by chapter so you can get a more specific understanding of exactly what the book covers. Also, if you've noticed a distinct lack of discussion regarding the book's Hobbit-related content, that'll be addressed in the next video too.